second category is called auxiliary percussion. So, which you might have guessed, that's all the little extra things. So, triangle, tambourine, claves, maracas. So, percussion is a lot of things, and it's utilized for a lot of different reasons. But today I'm going to focus on a pretty specific genre, which is known as rudimental traditional percussion. So, what does that mean? Start with the word traditional, which I'm sure many of you know is something that's much older, it's been practiced for a pretty long time. Here, traditional is referring mostly to Western traditions, specifically Western Europe, which is where a lot of the foundations of rudimental and classical drumming were established. Now, the word rudimental is defined as the foundations or the basics of something, which is true here, but that's mostly because the building blocks of this style, and largely the Western tradition of percussion as a whole, are known as rudiments. So rudiments not only make up every rhythm we play, but they're an important tool for developing technique and increasing skill, even for professional players. No matter a drummer's skill level, it's almost impossible for rudiments to be too easy. You can always dial up the difficulty by playing at a higher tempo, playing on a different surface or with heavier sticks, or even just by plugging the rudiment into a different context. The variability and flexibility that rudiments exhibit make it pretty clear why they're still foundational today, and beyond the fact that they encompass everything from rolls, or paradiddles, or flam accents, or rhythmics. So this first piece I'm going to play for you is a great example of rudimental traditional drumming because it seeks to highlight these individual rudiments. It was written by Jonas Pratt, who was born in Seneca Falls, New York in 1931. Pratt was inspired to begin drumming during World War II, seeing all the drum and bugle corps patriotically marching the streets after Pearl Harbor. Much to his mother's dismay, he quit piano lessons and picked up a drum around age 10, joining his local drum and bugle corps at 16, and then joining the Army shortly thereafter. From there, he was encouraged to audition for the West Point Band, and in 1959, he became the rudimental drum instructor and arranger for their field music unit. Beyond being an exceptional player and teacher, Pratt is most known for his book, 14 Modern Contest Solos for Snare Drum, which, although it's not so modern anymore after being written in 1949, it has remained a pretty commonplace teaching material even today. Pratt says in writing his books, he tried to maintain the rudiments without burying them, and people have praised him for managing to preserve the rudimental feel without the rigidity that other compositions from this time usually have, as well as the sometimes overwhelming complexity of more modern compositions. My first piece is the first solo from this book, called Drum Corps on Parade. It harkens back to older American drum corps and military marches, but has a somewhat modern feel to it as it extends phrases over the bar line and utilizes accents slightly more than rhythmic phrasing to maintain that pulse. You'll hear a lot of paradiddles, double paradiddles, five-stroke rolls, and some rhythmic cues towards the end. So I encourage you to listen and see if you can pick those up. So that piece, while it was written by an American composer, is based on Swiss rudiments. These originated in the Swiss military and were popularized in the United States in the early 20th century. The Swiss rudiments are used worldwide and are versatile because they can be used by drummers of all skill levels and easily applied across instruments. So although most militaries used to have their own rudiments, the Swiss and the French are some of the only ones distinct enough to be prominently used today. These two rudimental systems come together on the Percussive Art Society list of 40 rudiments, which is one of the most widely used teaching tools for drummers, especially in the US. Now there's a funny story on how the French rudiments came to be. Long ago, when military bands actually played on the battlefield, drums were used to communicate commands to the troops as they could be heard over the noise of battle. Story goes that at one of these battles, when the French took the field, they heard a retreat call, suspiciously shortly after. There was a lot of confusion because the general hadn't called for retreat and the drummers hadn't played the retreat. What had happened was their rudiments were so simple that their enemies' drummers were able to mimic them, and accurately enough that the French troops thought it was coming from their own band. So, knowing how stubborn the French can be, they turned around and created an entirely new rudimental system, which was complex enough that this would never happen to them again. And this system is still set apart today, known for its difficulty and unique, often syncopated feel compared to other rudiments. The second piece I'm going to play for you is from a book called 9 French-American Rudimental Solos, and it's built in part from these French rudiments. This book was written by Joseph Tompkins, who currently teaches at multiple schools throughout New York. Tompkins has published several works, but this book in particular highlights the experimental nature of his compositions, blending American and French traditions and leaving creative freedom to the performer. In Etude 3, which is the next selection I will be playing, he plays with time, freely switching between a duple and a triple feel, and uses a blend of rudiments to create sections within the piece. He even makes an attempt to quote Prokofiev, which I encourage you to see if you can pick that up. In this piece, Tompkins fluently switches between groupings of 3, 4, 5, and 6, utilizing French rudiments such as the inverted flam tap and the charge stroke. You may also notice he includes both open rolls and closed rolls, which highlights that blend of American versus French traditions. More movement. Who would have guessed? As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, percussion is an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of different instruments, and I make it a goal to be at least proficient in a couple of them. So while the rudimental traditional style doesn't easily lend itself to non-battery instruments, I wanted to showcase some of what mallet percussion has to offer, so my third selection is just a little bit different from the rest of my pieces. I'd like to introduce you to the vibraphone. The vibraphone's unique ability to play controlled, sustained notes sets it apart from other percussion instruments and makes it especially good for capturing specific emotions and playing in more legato styles. You may also notice I'll be switching to mallets instead of drumsticks. While these are oftentimes overlooked, different mallets can greatly impact the sound of the instrument, with a harder mallet emphasizing the strike of the bar, and the softer mallet drawing out a more whole, even tone. Different materials also create distinct sounds, like using a plastic versus a rubber mallet, or a yarn versus a cord mallet. For anyone who is wondering, these are weighted, medium softness yarn mallets. They provide a pretty light touch for softer sections, and then also give me some momentum for accents and crescendos. Waltz for a Windy Day is a solo for vibraphone, which was composed by John Wilmarth. Wilmarth is a great example of how multifaceted percussionists can be, as he plays jazz set, marching percussion, and mallet percussion. He teaches steel drum, and then on top of that, he's a composer for all of the above. He's taught all over the southern United States, largely in high school and college settings, but has also collaborated with organizations such as Bands of America, Yamaha, and the Percussive Arts Society. While vibraphone typically isn't a solo instrument, he wrote this piece for his wife and daughters, hoping to capture the feeling of a sunny, breezy day in South Carolina. The vibraphone gives this composition a hopeful, light tone, almost kind of sounding like a music box. This piece embodies what it means to play freely and expressively, giving the player creative freedom over pacing, pedaling, dampening, and overall phrasing. So please enjoy this snare drumming intermission. have had a chance to rest, I'm going to be moving on to the louder drum. And I promise it's for a good reason. For any of you that don't know, I have been an active member of the Manchester Pipe Band for going on about 9 years now. I'm going to need to move that drum, so give me just a second. This microphone doesn't stretch far enough. Never mind, I guess. So as I was saying, I've been a member of the Manchester Pipe Band for going on about 9 years now, which is what initially sparked my interest in rudimental drumming. For this reason, the remainder of my presentation will be focused on specifically the Scottish rudimental tradition. The union of bagpipes and drums began in the military in the 17th century, and while Scottish culture has been deeply intertwined with the bagpipe since roughly the 14th century, the instrument has an extensive history in Britain and other countries across Eastern Europe. At this time, the militaristic drumming style was developing similarly to other countries like Switzerland and France, with the distinctive sound and feel of Scottish rudimental music developing later. This distinction was brought about by incorporating traditional folk and dance music of the country. The bagpipes had long been used as a folk and dance instrument, so it was only natural that military marches drew inspiration from this more established cultural music, with full bands eventually adapting the original tunes altogether. As the line between military and folk music blurred, the rudimental drumming accompaniment was no longer strictly used in regimental settings. Today, drummers accompany bagpipers on several distinct types of tunes, including but not limited to marches, reels, strathspeys, and jigs. These pieces are of varying lengths and arrangements, some being only 30 seconds long and others having extensive repeats. You'll typically hear these played as part of a medley or collection of 2 or more songs, which can be identified by changes in time signature, tempo, and pulse. The next selection I have today is a pair of jigs, which is an excerpt from the Manchester Pipe Band's 2025 competition set. The word jig comes from the Old French jiguer, which means to jump. So naturally this style of dance has a very light, or style of dance music has a very light and flowing feel to it, often categorized by its fast tempo and triplet feel. There are several types of jigs, each written in compound time signatures, so that's a time signature based on the 8th note, such as slip jigs in 9/8, single jigs in 12/8, but the most common is double jigs in 6/8, which is what both of these are. The two jigs I have for you are titled Jones Jig and Hag at the Churn. As you probably could have guessed, Hag at the Churn is an old folk tune with no really specific origins, and is one of many tunes that were passed down through generations before being formally transcribed. Jones Jig, however, was found in the manuscripts of a piper named Henry Clough. He was well known throughout the UK in the late 1800s and came from a long line of pipers, succeeded by his son, who published his works along with several other manuscripts as the publication The Clough Family of Newsham. Between both tunes, you'll hear the bagpipes not going a single measure without playing a full triplet. The drum score here provides variation through various roll patterns, breaks, and keeps the music driving by liberal use of single-stroke fives, which is a staple of Scottish drumming. To accompany me today, I'd like to welcome the pipe major of Manchester Pipe Band, Dan Bislowski. Today I'd like to bring it back to something a little closer to the first march I played. Arthur Bignell of Lacrosse is a tune that was written by John McCall, a man credited as the inventor of the modern 2/4 competition march. He was born in Kent Scotland in 1860, and throughout his life, he not only excelled in piping and composition, but in nearly every Highland profession. He was a piper, a fiddler, a dancer, a singer, an athlete, as well as a composer, and he made a living solely through his success in competition and teaching. Before he died in 1943, McCall composed over 70 tunes, and those are just the ones that we know of. So many of them remain among the most popular even today. For anyone wondering who Arthur Bignell might have been, he was a Scottish Liberal politician who served as a member of British Parliament in the early 1900s. Long story short, he didn't do anything particularly spectacular, but McCall seemed to think he was worth writing about. He also composed pieces named after his wife, father, family clan, and sister-in-law. It's important to note that while many of these tunes are over a century old, none of them were written with drumming in mind. Each drum score is uniquely composed, typically commissioned by the player or an organization. Many classic tunes, such as this one, have different drumming scores from multiple sources, or can be played with universal or simplified scores in the given time signature. The drumming accompaniment I'll be playing today was written by J. Reed Maxwell, and is likely the most popular arrangement for this piece. Maxwell was born and raised in Scotland and is one of the most, if not the most, influential drummer in recent Highland drumming history. He was the lead drummer of the first band based out of Scotland to win the World Championships in 1987, and the first person to have led the drum corps of two separate bands to victory. Currently, Maxwell leads the drum corps of the Simon Fraser University Pipe Band in Canada, and over this last 40 years with the band, they've won the World Championships 9 times, with 10 drum corps titles, most recently winning in 2022. Maxwell has created an impressive library of drumming scores comprised of different styles of tunes, medleys, and exercise books, all of varying grade levels. When comparing this march to the first piece I played, there are a couple of key differences. Firstly, you're going to notice the swung nature of the rhythms. Unlike many traditional Western marches, and especially American marches, Scottish marches have what's known as a dot-cut feel, which is similar to the swung rhythms that you would hear in jazz music. Secondly, these marches are comprised of a series of repeated sections. Typically, a piece would have 2 or 4 sections, and each would repeat twice, with each section being concluded by a recurring tagline phrase. In Maxwell's Arthur Bignell score, that phrase is... So I encourage you to listen for that. There can be some variation in these repeated sections, with some having different pickup or lead-in notes, alternate endings, which are typically found in the last part, and in more universal scores, some parts may be played interchangeably. Lastly, across Scottish drumming, there are some core rudimental differences. You may remember earlier in my presentation, I demonstrated a rudiment called the Radimacue. That rudiment begins with a technique called a drag, which is where one hand plays a grace note before the other strikes the drum. In nearly every other area of rudimental drumming, this rhythm would be played open, or with 2 distinct beats of the drum being heard before the initial strike. In Scottish drumming, this rhythm is played closed with what's known as a dead stroke. This distinction, along with a liberal use of single strokes, triplets, and accented roll patterns, sets Scottish rudimental drumming apart, and although other cultures have created their own versions of the genre, the Scots did it first. That being said, I just want to give a big thank you to everyone for coming out tonight, and I hope you enjoy Arthur Bignell of Lacrosse. make it a little easier.
Ladies and gentlemen, I must say that